welcome to the Skald archive, Tom. How are you doing today?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me, Garrett. It's a pleasure to be on the Skald archive. Thanks to viewers of both for tuning in, and I hope it's going to be an interesting talk.
All right, and today we're going to be talking about Underworld, the Underworld, subject of high interest. So let's jump right into it. So the Underworld, the afterlife. I think I'm going to give the mic over to Thor since he has the first question for this.
Yeah, sure. First of all, yeah, I mean, you've got so many great videos. Everyone should check out your channel, all kinds of paganism stuff and Indo-European stuff. You said that this year was kind of, you spent a lot of your time focusing on the underworld. What was it that made you focus your area of research on that?
I think it started when, I read an essay over I think it was last winter, by Eric Dodge at Houston University, and he had basically taken the old work from Bruce Lincoln, who's like a really big name in Indo-European studies, and Bruce Lincoln had done this really cool reconstruction of the Indo-European worldview, the Indo-European mythology and cosmology specifically. And all that Eric Dodge did is sort of add some things that you think Bruce Lincoln missed. And it was just a really cool summary. And what it kept on, the title of it is Odin and Orpheus or something like that, because Dodge has really figured out like, oh, there's a lot of parallels between the Orphic cult in Greece and the Odin cult, and they're a bit too close. And then you can also see like, no, it's not because of transmission from Greece to Scandinavia, because actually if you look more widely, it's definitely in these Indo-European themes, and even further back to like the ancestors of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, who are shared by non-Indo-European groups such as certain Siberian and even Native American people. So which explains what I read last year when I was studying a little bit on shamanism. And I read stuff like about Ojibwe and Tungus people in Siberia, and I was like, that sounds like Odin. Really, it's like Nanaboso of Ojibwe. I was like, how the hell could there be something so like Odin in Native American lore? I just thought that was weird, and then just thought there's a coincidence. But then when I started reading Dodge and then I start looking at it, and like, because of genetic information, we know now that one of the main ancestral components of Native Americans when they came over from Siberia and they share with Siberians is this thing called ancient North Eurasians, these people who lived in Ice Age Siberia. And they're also one of the main ancestral components of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Proto-Indo-Europeans are like 50% of the ancestry of Scandinavians. So then you start to understand, okay, these people actually are, I mean, the Indo-Europeans you're talking like 5,000-6,000 years ago. So it's amazing when you can trace back a myth to Indo-Europeans that far. But now we can trace something back that's probably like 20,000 years old in the Ice Age in Siberia. Then it's that's crazy to me. I think that's amazing. But there's no other explanation for it. So no matter how crazy or incredible it sounds, it is by Occam's razor, the most rational explanation for the mythic correspondences, Native American, Siberian, and Indo-European peoples. And the thing that really just set it all off was like the waters of memory, which is like this theme that Dodge identified in different Indo-European myths, and there's some Siberian parallels as well. And this waters of memory are in the underworld, they're in hell, and they're beneath the roots of a world tree. And there are many, of course, we know Scandinavians have this world tree, Nordic Scandinavian religion had it, and probably other Germanic as well, because we have references to Irminsul, which appears to be the same thing. But the fact that Native Americans and Siberians have this world tree as well makes it very likely, in my opinion, that is an ancient North Eurasian trope and therefore it must have been in Indo-European religion, which explains why also you see in Greek religion this thing in hell about a white cypress tree by the river. And, you know, there's this white clay that the Norns put onto the world tree as well. So it's like, once you look at them, these sort of correspondences, they seem at first maybe, you know, just coincidental, but then as they add up, as I basically made a video at the beginning of the summer, or in the middle of the summer it came out, I think, was the world tree in hell. Indo-European cosmology, and I explain all this stuff. But then after doing that video, I just got more into it. I wanted to look deeper and deeper, and I kept on finding more stuff, and I realizing, actually going back over my years of study of Norse religion, like hell and the underworld, hell is the same thing, and the barrow and the grave are central to what we know about the Germanic religion. It's like, if it wasn't entirely centered on the grave and the dead, then for some reason what's recorded doesn't reflect that. But what is recorded is incredibly centered on the dead. And
Tom, not to cut you off, but what specifically makes the dead and their burial so important in their religion?
Well, it's hard to say what made it. Oh, you mean why do I make that claim, or why was it?
Why are you making that claim?
Well, as I said, it may be the bias of which sources survive to us. And of course, one of the main sources that survives to us is archaeology. And we base so much of archaeology on burials because they put stuff in the ground for us to find. Burials, all that ritual is about the dead. But then also some of the written sources like Ibn Fadlan, and also like in Beowulf and in Baldur's, Balder, there's like description of his funeral. So we do have like quite a lot of evidence about how they dispose of the dead. But even so, not enough, because even the written sources we have on Germanic burial customs don't encompass anywhere near the entirety of the huge diversity that is found in the archaeological record. So obviously there wasn't just one way to deal with the dead, but the practices involved with disposal of the dead, particularly the disposal of high status people, are extremely elaborate, very expensive, massive affairs. They would have been huge events. So even if we account for the fact that this ritual specifically is one that we will be biased towards focusing on its importance because it's one that we know about, and other rituals might have been just as big, but they don't survive in archaeological record, it still has to be accepted that these rituals were enormous. Like the Oseberg burial, that's taking months of stuff. Like that's a year, most of a year is focused on what happened at that burial. And this is nothing new with the Vikings or the Germanic people, even because we can find, the evidence of horse sacrifice at Barrows on the steppe in the Neolithic, like the early Indo-Europeans, they reckon that, I can't remember the calculation, but the amount of horse that was used, horses could have fed something like, I think it was, I can't remember how many thousand people, thousands of people. And the erection of the large barrows could involve, we're talking about the labor of hundreds of men. So this implies that this was a thing of massive importance. And like if we look at other cultures, like the Egyptian pyramids, this is a tomb for the dead. And the Neolithic cultures of megalithic Europe, like, these huge tombs like New Grange and things like that, the main things we associate with the megalith culture.
Yeah. So
these are all disposal of the dead.
So sorry to cut you off again. Are we seeing this kind of labor for really anyone? So somebody who would have been a farmer or a part of that 80 to 90% of the population we don't get to hear about, as opposed to also with royalty, like that kind of labor would have been going into everyone.
So this is really good timing. I made a video about this. I thought I was going to try and release it before our interview today so Tom could get a watch, but I made a video completely on funerals and burial practices in the Norse world. It's like an hour and a half long, so it's a good timing with this, but it's different with different times. In the Viking Age, you'll see, extravagant burials like the Oseberg ship and Gokstad ship, things like that, things that they spent months to do. But then you'll also see people thrown into just a hole in the ground. So peasants, it had to do with class and how much money, how much resources they had to spend. But if we go back to example for about 2,000 years ago, we see a lot more cremation, or there would be lots more cremation in Scandinavia. But if we go back to the Bronze Age, we see 50,000 burial mounds just in Denmark, something like that. So burial mounds were more common then. It seems like almost everyone got at least a small burial mound. So it depends on the time and the resources they had, really.
Okay.
There's fashions that are, like you say, regional and temporal. So barrows come in and out of fashion at different times in history, but also in different places. And of course, the one really important like trend is the boat burials. Like there's some really early boat burials of a kind of a boat in Norway, with people in boats in Norway like 2,000 years ago. But the actual, like what we call ship burial tradition, which lasted about 500 years and is so iconic for Vikings, and also included ship cremation, like that are described by Ibn Fadlan, for example. We don't find them in the archaeological record because they burned the bloody thing. But the buried ones everywhere from Anglo-Saxon England to Eastern Sweden, even the Salma burials in Estonia. And that's like, I think that's like combined with the barrows, and it's indicating a completely new ideas of the transport and the underworld, where boats suddenly become important. So these changes in fashions in disposal of the dead probably reflect changes in fashions in ideas about the underworld and the afterlife too. That's not to say that there was total flux in belief, like everyone was changing their beliefs all the time, but like they, at the end of the day, didn't really know for sure what happens when we die any more than we do. So there were probably competing theories about what would happen. And, you know, for that reason, competing ideas about disposal of the dead, whether even like if they agree that you should need a boat, then there's also the question of whether the boat should be burned or put in a barrow. And that's really interesting to me, to think about why that might be, and how they came to these conclusions.
That's a very interesting question, and I definitely want to ask about that later on in the video. But getting back to the subject of the underworld, as opposed to like other afterlives and the different mythologies, different beliefs, what makes an underworld an underworld? You spoke a little bit about this river or body of water and even a tree, but what kinds of things associated with the underworld are always there in whichever culture we're talking about?
Well, the underworld is generally always associated with the dead. Certainly in Indo-European religions, it's always associated with the dead. But this idea of a tiered cosmos with three principal things is shared with the Native American and Siberian religions. So it must be of ancient North Eurasian provenance. And it's familiar to any Christians because they've got heaven, earth, and hell. Well, like the same basic principle applies for most Indo-European and religions, and many Native Americans one too, where there's this world, the Middle Earth, which has within it strange places that are not exactly seen. Like there are things in this Middle Earth, including like the dwarves, or that can dwell within the rocks, or like wights, or whatever you want to call, like entities that dwell within this world that aren't fully seen. And Jotunheim, although like you can see these starting from the Victorian times onwards, like people drawing trees with little branches with different worlds coming on, like to show Norse cosmology, they're not really representative. And Jotunheim is a bit of a hard one to really fit in, because a lot of the time what's been called Jotunheim is really conflated with the underworld, and other times Jotunheim is very clearly referring to something in the middle world, our world, which is outside the world of men. So the Jotunar dwell where men don't. So at the edge of the world of men is where the Jotuns come, but also sometimes they're associated with the underworld. So Jotunheim as this distinct separate world from the world of the men, the underworld, and the gods is a little bit of a misnomer, in my opinion. But the underworld is a place, for the most part, where the dead go, and it's at the roots of the world tree. Although not all Indo-European religions specify that it's at the roots, but some of them specify there is a tree within it. The tree is associated very much with the underworld in all of them, but within the Germanic tradition, the Norse tradition, it's under the roots.
Right. And how about the locations of the underworld? Is there any kind of common theme that they have at the locations? For example, in the Norse, it's to the north, or it can be underground sometimes. I know the Norse have the underworld Hel over the river Yule, and the Greek is the river Styx, and I think the Hindu even has a river too that they cross. Is there any kind of certain similar directions or ways that you have to cross to get to the underworld?
And is it also
Well,
kind of like literally underneath? Is it kind of like being in an underground cavern?
mm.
There are
Well, I
some,
think like
because there are some myths, if you go from what I can recall off the top of my head, if you're going into more of the South American and I think maybe certain tribes in Australia, they literally describe it as somewhere that is underneath the ground.
yeah, well, it's definitely under the ground, beneath the earth. It's a telluric location, chthonic, and it's got. I mean, there's association certainly with the north. Like in Germanic tradition, it's north, but also down.
Yep.
Whereas there's also a kind of conversely, in other traditions, it's more explicit that there's a kind of a heaven which is south and up. So whereas in the Germanic tradition, it doesn't make that absolutely clear, but I think that they did think of something equivalent. We can get to that later. But now to talk about what the locations of the underworld, there's the river. There's many rivers there. So like in Greek underworld, Hades or Hades, there's 5 rivers, including the Styx. But I think there must have been at least 5, probably more in the Germanic tradition, but I'm only aware of 4 that are named. Of course, the river Yule, and that arguably is the same as the Gal in Gallo horn, which Heimdall blows, means that's the horn of Yule, which if that's correct etymologically, then that explains why it is associated with Mimis Brunner, because it's not just the horn that you blow, it's a horn you drink from, and you use the horn of Gjallarhorn to drink the memory water, Mimis Brunner, because Mimir essentially is the root meaning of the name of this being is memory. And so it seems that the Mimis Brunner means like a well of memory, and this is consistent with all the other Indo-European religions have this idea of the waters of memory, because when you die, your memories are washed away in the rivers of hell, and then you can reincarnate, but you won't remember your life. But this in the Germanic tradition, I think, becomes distilled in Mimis Brunner, which is why Odin wants to drink from it, because it gives him great wisdom, and he's willing to give an eye to the well to obtain the wisdom of accumulated knowledge of the dead. And if it seems strange that an immortal, a god, would seek wisdom from dead mortals, we have to explain the fact that throughout there's many Germanic myths of Odin and others like Svipdag traveling to hell to learn special knowledge from dead mortals. So there's something about being a dead mortal that is associated with wisdom in the Germanic tradition that is desirable, and that's what certain types of magic are about, and certain types of rituals are about obtaining the wisdom of hell. But the other rivers, there's also in Völuspá 39, Völuspá 39 says that there's the dead wade through the rivers of hell, and it specifies that like the bad guys, like treacherous, like sex criminals and murderers, these people are wading through the rivers. So wading is a bad thing, maybe it's better not to wade, maybe it's better to have a boat. Is that what it's saying there? And Völuspá 35, it mentions a river called Slíðr, and that it says comes from Fergalmir, which is one of the 3 springs, the main springs, Urthabrunner, Mimisbrunner, and Fergalmir. And it says it's filled with swords, it's full of weapons, and other Germanic kennings talk about rivers flowing with weapons. And of course, we find in Scandinavia many rivers filled with we dig up swords, like in Britain as well. In the Thames, we find like seaxes and stuff. So like Germanic people and the Celts before them were chucking weapons in rivers and bogs sometimes, and even lakes, although Scandinavians didn't deposit weapons in lakes. But the people in Britain did. But the idea, therefore, is that some kind of ritual action of the living is associated with the presence of rivers of weapons in the river Slíðr. Then there's also in this Grögaldur, the spell of Grö, it mentions when Svipdag has to talk to his dead mother to get advice on going to hell, basically. She's in a barrow, and she gives him 9 spells that he can use. And the third one mentions to hell hence let fair Hron and Uth, maybe dry the deeps for thee. And I think generally agreed that Hron and Uth are two rivers of hell. So there we've got 4 rivers named in hell, but I think there were probably many others, and each one had some significance. We're building a picture up of a place. It's very the general associations of hell. There's lots of water there. There's lots of halls there, like Eluthnir is hell, the woman's hall. And there's also like a horrible. There's one of the rivers has a bank called Norstrand, which is a place where the bad guys go and get punished by Nithog, the big snake. And there's also a hall there, and that hall is made up of snakes. It's got snakes in the roof and stuff, and they drip venom on bad guys who go in there. So there's many halls in hell, and my opinion is, I'll come to this later if you want, that Valhall is in hell, not in Asgard, but that's another thing. But on that general subject, Odin is twice mentioned as a ferryman, once in the Edda and once in the Saga of Volsunga, specifically in reference to the underworld. So he is there, a psychopomp, clearly in a more like conventional sense, ferrying people across. And I think that pertains to an earlier role of Odin that was more associated with. And also in Harbersljóð, he was, when he has an argument with Thor, and there he is a ferryman as well. So obviously he's not a ferryman in Asgard, is he? It's something to do with hell. And these rivers, and I think these rivers, I mean, Fergomir, I mentioned before, comes from, it's associated with the sap of Yggdrasil and the stag Eikthrunir, but the other sources of rivers, Uthabrunna, is associated with fate, and the Norns who tend to the world tree and put clay on it, and that is also a youth-giving, life-giving water. And Mimisbrunna, as I mentioned, is associated with the memories of the dead. So I think all these waters have associations with the underworld, even though they're not said, like they're not all said to be in hell, but Mimisbrunner is said to be in underneath the roots, and so is Uthabrunna. So I think they're all in hell, and and Valhall was in hell as well. So my version of the cosmology of Germanics is in a way simplified, because I think like it became in the sources we have, they've like put them on different places where they're not associated with the underworld when they were before. And I can elaborate on that if you like.
Yeah, that's awesome, and I've actually never even thought about that. That's completely good. Thank you for that idea. Now, so a lot of things are tying up this idea of associating like rivers or bodies of waters with hell. It could be like most of them in the mythology and sources that we read that, and also we know how people were, sent out to sea on a ship, or they were buried, a lot of burials right next to lakes and rivers, like you said, with the weapons there too. And also the lakes, especially in Scandinavian folk tradition later on in time, were said to be a place where the dead were, or some harmful spirits were. So it all ties up. But what it kind of leads on to my next question: what kind of can funeral or burial practices influence this journey to the afterlife or underworld? Of course, with the ship burials and ship cremations, pretty clear that would accompany you to the afterlife to maybe make that trip across the river easier. But are there any other things, maybe burial or funeral practice evidence that kind of facilitated that journey to the underworld that we know of?
Sure. Well, when it comes to cremation, that's something that goes back, into prehistory, long prehistory, and comes in and out of fashion. The early Indo-Europeans didn't cremate, but some of the Neolithic Europeans did. And it seems like as they integrated more, like the two things became like the Barrows and interments of Indo-Europeans and the cremations of non-Indo-Europeans get mixed in different ways. But in Ibn Fadlan's account, he asks the Arab asks a Viking why they're burning the dead, and he says something like, "You Arabs are fools because you bury the dead and let them be eaten by worms, whereas we burn them up in an instant, so they instantly attain paradise," using the Arabic translation paradise, so it's meaning some kind of a heaven. So like if that account is to be believed, then the purpose of cremation from the Germanic perspective was to speed up the journey. It was saying help the guy get there quicker. and the faster the higher the flames, the better. So that sounds plausible to me. The boat thing does not begin with the ship burial tradition, because we have the stone boats going all the way back to the Nordic Bronze Age. So the stone boats continue all the way into the end of the Viking era. So that's one of the most long-lived like religious traditions of Scandinavia, because it survived from the Nordic Bronze Age, where most practices from the Nordic Bronze Age didn't. And I speculate in my video on that actually isn't the reflects a different meaning. The original function of the boat had some kind of, because these stone boats aren't consistently associated with funerals. They are sometimes, but they're not exclusively, and they're just as much
always
used
someone
as,
buried there, right?
Yeah.
And for the people, we'll maybe
them.
put an image up here on the video. The stone, boats he's talking about. It's like flat land, and there are basically stones like stacked around whatever burial sites in the shape of a ship.
They're often in burial mounds, so I think they should be associated with the dead. They're not always in burial grounds, but they usually are, and they appear to have, I think initially some solar associations, which of the Nordic Bronze Age cult, but later not so much, and more about more likely to have some relation to the cult of Vanir, specifically Freya and her horse Sesrumnir, which she has a separate afterlife, which I don't think is in hell. Folkvanger, it could be, but it does seem like this. Most Indo-European religions have some conception of a heaven, which is seen as a green, verdant place. And in the Ibn Fadlan account, Garrett was just asking about, that when they lift up the slave girl who they sacrifice at the funeral, she says, "I see paradise." Translated again, paradise, as the other Viking guy said to Ibn, which is like their word for heaven, but it's paradise and it's verdant and green. And this is like the Elysian fields in Greek myth, and like there's many other examples I've given in my video of like different Indo-European notions of a field, a meadow, beautiful meadow where people go when they're dead, or like some good people go. And Folkvang means people field. And it's cognate with Anglo-Saxon afterlife called Neorksnawang, and Wang and Vang, it's the same thing, it's field. Neorksna, I'm not sure on the etymology, but it could mean corpse field, in which case it doesn't sound so nice. But the idea is that based on the fact that there's a list of names of different famous ships, Athula is an Eddic list of names of ships, including Noah's Ark and things like that. It mentions Sesrumnir as a ship, which is also elsewhere called Freya's Hall in Folkvang. But so is her hall actually a ship in a field? Well, that's what we see. These stone boats are like ships in fields. So maybe that was like some kind of association with her. It does seem plausible. So what was the question about originally about different types of disposal of the dead? So that's you got the barrow then is the other thing, which comes from, and the horse as well, I should mention. So I did my dissertation on horses, and that's called Riding to Valhalla, because I think the ancient tradition, Indo-European tradition of horse burial and horse cremation was really massively important in Germanic culture and have been preserved very well in it. So Anglo-Saxons and Vikings and other Germanic people were really big on horses at funerals. So sacrificing horses, sometimes cutting their heads off. Sometimes the horses are cremated. Sometimes they're decapitated and buried. Sometimes they're buried with tack, like for riding, and other times they're not. So I think in my dissertation, I argue there's different cults going on. I think one is a cult of Woden, where like these very beautifully decked out military horses is probably like something to do with Woden and sacrifices, because we know horse sacrifice at Yule is for Odin. And the other might be something more to do with the Vanir cult, because Freya, we know Freyr had horses dedicated to him, like Frey Faxi, and horses were sacrificed to Freyr quite a lot in the sources we have. So I think that the horses are also, like the boat, a way of riding to the afterlife, because Odin uses Sleipnir, and Hermodr uses Sleipnir as well to ride to hell. So you can use a horse for this journey. So, and then the barrow is, which is also of Indo-European origin, is called in one kenning Dalthradura, and is frequently in different sources a gate of hell. It's a gateway. Dalthradura means doors of the dead, but it's also called the gateway to hell. So the barrow is somewhere where not only the dead enter hell, but where the dead can come back, and where you, as a living man, can converse with the dead. You can go there and receive divine visions in your dreams if you sleep on top of a barrow, or if you know the right galdur, the right songs, you can converse with the dead awake, or interact with them and extract wisdom from them. And the barrow in the Norse sources is confusing because it's not really, it's almost conflated with hell. And in a way, many of the main principal like descriptors that by which we identify hell, which is that it's cold, it's wet, and it's got snakes in it, those are all true for barrows as well. And barrows, like if I dig in my garden, I get these things called slow worms, and they're like one of three reptiles that could be called a worm in Northern Europe. The other two are the grass snake, which is sacred in Lithuanian paganism, for example, the adder, which is specifically associated with Woden in the Anglo-Saxon charm, the 9-herb charm, so 9 herbs charm, and the slow worm, as we call it, which is actually a lizard that has no legs, so it looks like a snake, but it's called a copper orm in Swedish. I don't know what it's called in Norwegian, but they live underground, and when you dig a hole, they're there. So whenever you were digging a grave, you would see these things wriggling around. And so they would associate them, they associated in other Indo-European religions as well, including in India. The underworld is associated with snakes. And I think that in a lot of the imagery that they used to describe hell is also poetically describing the interior of a barrow or the grave. And they're like, the world of hell is kind of imagined somehow as being the accumulative interiors of all the barrows or something like that. It's hard to understand with like our modern conceptions of space and like physical space, but I think that that's something that they conceived of.
Yeah, that's another thing I never thought about either. Thank you again for that. It's with this, especially with the snakes, and it's it goes back to this idea of kind of animism and sympathetic magic that I always speak about. It's like, it's not just they're referring to hell as the one burial mound or grave there. It's like all of them collectively, the energy that is in those burial mounds collectively. So that's really, really interesting. And thank you for, it brings up some more ideas. People will ask the next question. It sounds kind of basic, and maybe we don't have so much sources for it, but what was the underworld like for the dead? There might be some things about it, but people who actually do follow these beliefs like I do, they're going to want to know this, how they would spend their afterlife. So what do we know about what the underworld is like for the dead? Is it pleasant, unpleasant? Are there things, activities, events that are happen, or any types of common things that we know about that?
Yeah, well, it's hard. It's a bit conflicting in the sources. Like, definitely the idea of being around snakes is not good in their worldview. Like, they might not always think of snakes as being a bad thing. Like, it's not universally like snake equals evil, like in the Christian symbology, but it certainly isn't something you want to do to be in a snake pit, like Gunnar in the story where he gets thrown into a snake pit. And the snake pit is kind of like a metaphor for the hell, in my opinion, like, because it's like, it happens to Ragnar Lothbrok as well. Like, it's not a good place. It's not a good way to die in a pit full of snakes. But the way that hell is associated with snakes, therefore, specifically the bad part of hell is especially associated with snakes. That makes me think it's a bad place. And it's not just like you have in the Norse sources I mentioned already. You've got Norstrand, where like there's the hall where people are taught like drip venom from snakes and stuff like that. But like in the Anglo-Saxon sources, which as an Englishman, they're quite important for me. There is, for example, in the poem Judith, it talks about Wurmsela, and elsewhere it says Wurmjaer. So Wurmsela means the snake hall, and that probably refers to the same place as at Norstrand. and Wurmjæret is like the worm place, the worm enclosure, which may refer to the entirety of hell itself. So I think that, like, in that perspective, we should definitely think of it as being negative. But elsewhere, it's like, is it really that bad? Because people are, when Balder dies, he's having a feast. And when other people also are like, okay, so other negative things, like hell owns things like her hall, Eljuthniv, means storm increaser. So that sounds bad. Her plate is called, it means, her name of her plate is hunger. It's like the worst thing to call a plate. And her knife is called starvation. So like, her threshold is called falling pit. And like some other Indo-European like notions of the underworld and of the woman of the underworld, the goddess of the underworld, is like you fall into a pit and she pulls you down with these cords. And hell has these hellia rape. It talks about like the ropes of hell she uses to pull you down. So it's like a falling thing. That's what sounds very bad. So I wouldn't say hell is good, but then, like, as I said, Balder has a feast. Some people even farm there. The people who are there are able to enjoy food and drink. They drink alcohol, some of them at least. And there's not just Eljuthniv. That's probably a bad hall, or maybe it's not the worst. Norstrand is the worst hall, but I think they're probably nice halls. And my opinion, as I mentioned before, Valhall is in hell. And I've got a few ways of justifying that. Like in Gisli Saga, it says it's the custom to put hell shoes on someone who's going to walk to Valhall. So specifically, you have to wear the hell shoes to get to Valhall. Like, it's a very clear association. And in Saxo Grammaticus' account of Hadinus' journey to hell, it says, after crossing the river of weapons, when then you've got that mentioned, I think earlier, that corresponds to hell. The river of weapons is in hell, Slither, in the Icelandic source. So the Danish guy is reinforcing that. And after that river, you see two armies engaged in a conflict, which a woman who is a psychopomp declares to be unending. A battle in hell of two armies that never ends. It's exactly the same as the Eddic description of what happens at Valhall. The guys just fight all day and then they come back to life and then they go have a drink or whatever. That, I really think Valhall, and as I said also, Odin is a ferryman in hell in several sources. That's like his job. So I think Valhall is one of the good places in hell, actually. And everyone goes to hell to start with. Like even Balder goes to hell to start with. And some people go up to a kind of meadow, like Folkvang. I'm not clear exactly what criteria qualifies one to go there, but I know what qualifies one to enter Valhall, because they tell us that you have to be a warrior. If you die, as you live and die as a warrior in life, then you go, and in hell, you go to the hall where the warriors go. But, and if you behave like a son of a bitch, then you go to Norstrand. So I'm sure there are all kinds of other halls that we don't know about, which were appropriate destinations in hell. Some of them very nice, some of them all right, and some of them very horrible. But that's the short version of it, Danny.
Yeah, very good, very good. That's a little information for people we won't know until we go there, but that's at least some live a good life, and you'll go to the pleasant places there. This is a long question, but we don't have to. That could be a whole hour-long talk anyway. But could we touch on some of the deities of the underworld and their function? At least a couple of them that stand out. There's Hel, of course, and any others that you think are noteworthy speaking about.
Well, I got confused about this with the Germanic tradition. I'm a practicing Germanic pagan, and I look at the Indo-European examples to try and better understand what I can't find out about from the Germanic sources. But like Hel is the only deity who's specified as the deity of Hel. The whole place is named after her. But like when we look at other Indo-European religions, there's usually a male and a female, and they're not necessarily like husband and wife. Like, Hades is associated with Persephone, but she's not the goddess of hell. Like Hades is the male god of hell, and the place is named after him, Hades, just like our hell is named after hell. But his name is not cognate with hell, but Calypso, who recognized from the Odyssey, her name is cognate with hell. And some people think she was originally a goddess of the underworld. And she's also cognate with Keres, which is a kind of, it's not a goddess, it's something a bit like a Valkyrie. It's like a scary female entity of death who has ropes which pull you down to the underworld, just like hell. So I think Calypso was associated with Keres, kind of like maybe like Freya is associated a bit with like the Valkyries, although they're more associated with Odin. But in the Celtic, like Gaelic world, northwestern Scotland and Ireland, there's Don is like the main, ancestor of the Gaels. He's like he lives in a hall in the underworld, just like a bit like Valhall. If you accept my theory that Valhall is in hell, it's not I didn't invent it. Others believe it too. But there's also Cailleach, who's like a scary witch woman who is associated with underworld as well, but not directly connected to Don. And she's got these associations with like these underground lakes, like waters of youth and water, like the Norns and things. So and then in India, you've got Yama, who is like, just like Don, he's like this god of a hall in the underworld where the dead go to be punished. But there's also Nirti, who's a goddess of death, who has cords that pull people down. So there's always a male and a female. So why is it that in our Germanic sources, hell is all alone down there, unless there is also another hall ruled in hell, not hers, ruled by a man like Odin. So that's another reason I really think there's a male and a female, the two separate deities of hell, or maybe Loki because he's sort of getting venom dripped on him down there. I'm not sure, but it could be Odin was originally this underworld god. So much of what he does is in the underworld, but then again, so many times he has to journey there, which implies he doesn't live there. So it's a bit complicated because Odin is such a multifaceted and complicated character, and it's hard to discern whether he once was. My instinct is that he is a god who's absorbed the aspects of other gods, so that he is at once like the chief god of heaven, but also the chief god of hell, and he's kind of mixed these two sort of aspects together, which is why sometimes it's a bit confusing to try and understand where Valhall is and things like that. But within the Germanic religion, there's only one like unambiguous deity of hell, and that's hell herself.
Yeah, so that's especially Odin. That's that kind of leads into my next question. And you spoke a little bit about it before: journeys of the living into the underworld, just for a certain time to consult with the dead, whether it being a shamanic type of ritual, just like Odin and Hermodr, Sleipnir. What can we say about that? And are there any? There's lots of sources actually for that in the Norse in the Norse beliefs, but any other Indo-European tradition of doing some sort of ritual to go to the underworld and consult with the dead or do whatever they need to do?
Yeah, right. This is so massive in the Germanic religion. Like Garrett was asking me earlier, like, how do I justify the idea that I was saying at the beginning, like audaciously, the Germanic religion was all about the dead, all about the underworld. Well, one of the reasons I say that is because there's so many examples of people trying to go into the grave, trying to go into a barrow, or to learn magic songs, learn Galdr, learn the wisdom of hell, learn like even Odin himself has to learn how he can avenge Baldur and things like this. Like you can learn so much from the dead in the Germanic religion. And what Eric Dodge was writing is how similar it is to the cult of Orpheus, who makes his journey to the underworld, and his head becomes a source of wisdom, his severed head, just like Mimir's severed head is a source of wisdom. So it's like there's this ancient Indo-European head cult, which is probably related to the Celtic tradition of cutting off heads and keeping them as like, people say like crudely it was trophies, but maybe they weren't trophies. Maybe there was some kind of device, like in the Northmen, like the head of Hymir is used as a way of like speaking the wisdom of hell to the living. And that's what is being described when after the Asir-Vanir war, Odin preserves and pickles the head of Mimir. That's the function of that. But you have, besides these people, you've got Odysseus goes to hell on his journey, Svipdag. There's so many, actually. It's like a very Indo-European trait. that you have a hero who makes a journey to hell for one reason or another, and he has to try and then come back again, to go there and back again. And the conclusion that Dodge has made, and I think Lincoln as well, and I agree with it, is that this myth corresponds to a ritual action that was used in life. And of course, in the Germanic case, we really know that there certainly were like ritual actions of like women, like witches and male witches probably too, and other people who would go to a barrow to learn things from the dead, or maybe in their dream they're descending into hell to converse with the dead when they sleep on the barrows, or when they sleep on a skin of an animal. In the Gaelic parts of Britain, it's the same thing. Like you can achieve the same thing as if you haven't got a barrow nearby, you sleep on a skin. This kind of thing is perennial around Europe, with these traditions of obtaining the special wisdom of dreams, and I made a video about that too. And I think that this is something needs to be looked at a lot more, because it's something not just like a quirky thing that some weirdos did in those times. I think it was actually a really central part of their religions, where they considered the dead to be a massive resource to be exploited, in the sense of obtaining wisdom and learning all sorts of things, practical stuff about like, how can I defeat my enemy? Or sometimes like more mysterious things like ancient songs, or like, magical songs.
The importance of keeping your history alive.
Yeah. And I've said before, the barrow is a way of making the dead not only present in from the dead people from the past, present in the now. They're also like, it makes them prominent in the landscape. These barrows were up on the hilltop, like looking down on everyone. Like it's impossible for them not to be conscious all the time. It's not like some hidden graveyard in a churchyard in the valley like we have now. It's like these big monuments that they see the dead and remember them. I think you can try and imagine what kind of worldview someone who treats the dead in that way might have, and then you can start to approach the religion in the way they did.
Very cool, very interesting. Again, that's I've got like maybe one question to conclude with, but do you have any things you want to cover, Jared? We have a little bit of time still.
I'm Jared now.
Garrett.
No worries.
My friend is called Jared. I was just speaking to when I first woke up. I'm mispronouncing Garrett.
From Jared to Garrett.
Yeah.
Or is one of the many names my name is mispronounced as. There's a couple questions backtracking. The first one I want to ask about the Odin connection with the Native Americans.
Right. So what I noticed is that I don't know much about Native American religion, so I should say that outright in case I offend any Native Americans or people who are experts in Native American religions and I get something wrong. But I read about the figure of Nanaboso in the Ojibwe religion, and he is like, he's a figure who's like a shamanic figure, but he gifted the power of shamanism to mankind, but he had to take that by force in a transgressive way from the Manitou, who are like their spirit powers or gods, or I don't know if that's offensive to call them gods. He's like a mythic shape-shifting figure, and he sacrifices himself in order to give mankind the shamanic power. That to me is a lot like Odin sacrifices himself and he gifts mankind like the meat of poetry, and he gifts mankind in the other myth he gives them breath, which is spirit, and he gives them the runes. Like he's like he gifts us so much of our wisdom and power, and he makes sacrifice of himself. And this guy is not like he has this association with the world tree, and there are other Native American people also who have I'll read this out from my script from my world tree video. The ritual drum of the Ojibwe healing shaman represents the world tree, and the drum and the shaman become the cosmic axis which penetrates the divine realms, so that healing power can be directed from there into a patient. So like their association with the tree, of course, our principal deity Odin is very much associated with the tree, to the extent that Yggdrasil itself is probably a kenning that connects Ygg, which is Odin, to the tree. And like there are other Native American and Siberian people who have this idea of like a figure who hangs on the roots of the tree, or hangs from it. And that's usually a deity of the underworld. And to me, that is, it can be a woman, it can be a man, but to me, it sounds very Odinic, hanging from this tree. Of course, Odin isn't conventionally associated as the god of the underworld, but that's why I stressed in this interview that I really think that if he at one point he did have that, or even in the sagas he does have that association with the underworld. But it's very complicated because he also is someone who visits the underworld. So it's like he was once a ferryman or something. But yeah, does that answer your question?
That does. And then going to
There's also Votan, right? This is more like I think it's from, is it Aztec or Mayan? There's some figure that came in named Votan that's very similar to Odin too, but that's that's a bit further south in Central America type of thing.
But the Central American Book of the Dead, which I've not read, I was emailed by a person who is an expert on it, and he told me that there was loads of stuff I missed that parallel Indo-European myth in that too. So of course the Central Americans have loads of stuff that like similar I didn't know about, but I haven't read the Book of the Dead. But
yeah, it's good also to kind of hear about these similarities at the technical level. And then this came up during the interview. You talked about a male and a female counterpart each in the underworld. Do you think that was important to have a feminine and a masculine deity? Like if it served a purpose?
No, I don't think it I don't know why. I think it's not so much the balance like masculine and feminine principles with the notions of death necessarily, because you can have like many goddesses and gods, and it's like Freya is worshipped for herself, and she has like this sort of secondary figure who's her boyfriend or her whatever, who's away, but he's not really important to us as much. And it's like Thor is very important, but Sif is maybe in the Solstice, she just doesn't seem to be as prominent, the deity. So like deities have consorts, but that's just because they're like divine personalities, and like humans we have our wives, so why shouldn't the gods have theirs? So it's just a natural way of understanding a divine personality to have, that they have their families. But these underworld deities are never married. None of the examples I gave are they're not partners. They don't live in the same halls. They have like separate, but they're both associated with the underworld. And that's what I found confusing, because Hades does have a partner, Persephone, but she's not a goddess of the underworld. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't exactly understand why there are these male and female. There's a male and a female figure in the underworld, and often their roles in the different traditions swap over or they overlap, and it's a bit messy. And I don't really understand what's going on. It may be that there was somehow a tradition, one tradition of a male underworld god and one of a female, and then they just sort of merged them in Proto-Indo-European times in a clumsy way, and that just sort of manifested in different ways in different Indo-European religions. But I don't know.
Yeah, no worries. It's interesting. It clicked for me, or I started looking at it differently when Thor in one of his videos talked about how Hinduism is the closest to Norse religion, and so
still existing. Yeah.
And so I was,
excuse me,
no worries. So it made me curious if the deity system, um, or in the religion itself, everything works on a karmic standpoint. Everything is always in a system to make some sort of balance.
Yes, I think that that is central to, there is a notion of balance and order in pretty much every religion, especially traditional religions, but even going right back to like the most, crude animistic hunter-gatherer religions. I'm sure they have this idea of order needs to be maintained against a chaotic opposition. Yes, there certainly are a lot of parallels with Hinduism and Norse religion, but specifically more so with the Vedic religion, which was practiced in Bronze Age India and is preserved for us in the Rig Veda, which is much closer to Germanic religion because it's got things like horse sacrifices and, calling on Indra for strength in battle and things like that, which doesn't really resemble what Hindus do today.
And last question from me, at least, speaking about the Hinduism and the parallels, reincarnation and the Norse and European beliefs and the underworld, hell, whatever. We have sources, so people watching don't need to worry. If they go to hell, they can be reborn. That has definitely happened in a few sources we have. But is there anything we know from the Norse or other mythologies of ways that you can maybe speed up that reincarnation process, or who gets reincarnated versus who doesn't? Any thoughts on that you might have?
Yeah, sure. So as I've been studying over the years, different sorts of paganism, because I realized that it's always there. Everyone knows that that reincarnation is this thing. Everyone knows the Hindus, and then as the extension, the Buddhists believe in reincarnation. And it's assumed that it's just this Indian invention. But is it possible that the Aryan invaders of India brought that with them? And that was it was a tradition that was common in Europe. The Romans usually don't believe in that sort of thing, and they talk about the Celts who did as an other, and they talk about the way Celts believed in reincarnation as something other. But there is evidence in Greco-Roman sources that some people did believe it, and they specifically associate it with the doctrine of Pythagoras. And as a result, because Pythagoras was so influential on Platonic philosophy, it becomes part of the beliefs in Platonism. And also some Platonic philosophers are influenced by Egyptian paganism, and Egyptians, did also believe in a kind of reincarnation, transmigration of souls. So the Celts did. What about other Europeans? The Slavs did as well, in my opinion. I'll give you the two sources, or a couple of sources I got on it, because there's not very many, there's very, very little written on Slavic, actual proper Slavic sources. So in 944, there was a treaty concluded between Prince Igor and Byzantium. And it was said, those who will violate the treaty, let them have no help from God or from Perun. So it's invoking the god of the Slavs and the god of the Byzantians. And may their shields not protect them, and may they die from their own swords, arrows, and other weapons of their own, and let them be slaves in their next life. So obviously that part was not added on for the Christians, because there's no slavery, and they're not talking about Christian heaven or hell. That was for the Slavs, and the idea that you could manifest as a slave. That reminds me a lot of in Helga Kvidar Hundingsbana 2, the poem, the Eddic poem. It says that Hunding will perform low status slave labor, like dog walking, foot washing, pig cleaning out the pigs and stuff in Valhall. So even people in Valhalla can have slave-like jobs in that life. But maybe that's not the next life, because doesn't the next life mean the life in the afterlife, or does it mean reincarnation? Well, anyway, there's another Slavic source that's more clearly reincarnation in accounts from Belarusian folklore by Michael Fedorowski in 1897. So it's quite a recent source. It's not an ancient source, but it says God will take the soul out of one body and put it in another. So that's Christians believing in reincarnation. So the Slavic peasants had preserved beliefs in reincarnation until recently. And as for like the Nordic equivalents, you got in Thorstein's saga Vikingsson, it recounts a line of local kings who ruled over Olfheim, and who, since they had elven blood, were said to be more beautiful than most men. And I think all elves are like a certain type of reincarnated dead person, but not everyone becomes elves. My opinion is that elf is like a very noble ancestor, because elves are associated with barrows, of course, and barrows are where you bury the dead, but not everyone gets a barrow. And like there's a good example of that specific thing where a guy called Olaf, after he dies, he gets buried in a barrow, and then afterwards people call him Olafur Girstafr Elfr. So Olaf, the elf of Girstad. So, and he also, that would imply he's reincarnated as an elf. But then even the Christians in Norway believed that Saint Olaf the Good, not Saint Olaf not Olaf Tryggvason, Saint Olaf Haraldsson, Olaf the Good, was a reincarnation of Olaf the Elf. So,
and that story for people watching, that was done basically when the spirit of the first Olaf, who was dead, buried in the mound, instructed a servant or something to go in and dig into the mound and then take up a sword and a ring and give that to a newborn child, and that child was going to be reincarnated, and that was Saint Olaf. So that's one way maybe to control some reincarnation, but there's probably lots more too that we don't know.
And the name there is too important, because by the Viking Age, they come to believe that naming the child after a dead relative could encourage that person to be reincarnated in it. So that's partly why they thought connected Olaf Elf with Olaf, Saint Olaf. But the earlier Germanic people in the migration era had a different naming practice, which was you can see it in like Anglo-Saxon England and in Nordic things earlier, where it's like alliterative. So they would name the child with a name that had the same beginning as an ancestor, rather than the exact same name. So it seems to me, and also I got this from Hilda Ellis Davison. I didn't invent, I'm not claiming her theory as my own, but originally they would encourage the reincarnation of an ancestor by giving a name that alliterates with their name. But then by the Viking Age, they just said, just give them the same name as that ancestor. So there's certain techniques, and also like you're talking about taking items away from the dead, or going into a barrow and taking something from that dead and giving it to the baby is a way of like connecting them. So definitely, I think that the Germanic people believed in reincarnation. Definitely, they believed in hell and the afterlife. But there's also like, there's some lovely green, verdant paradise meadow. I don't know how you get there, but they believed in it. It's sometimes called Odin Saker or Glassisveller, and in Germanic sources, and it's sometimes they talk about it as being southeast of India, but obviously that's like just meaning a long way away. But it's somehow you can get there, and then when you go there, you never die, which doesn't make sense because the people who go there are dead. But but then you can also reincarnate and become just a person again. So it seems to me that I'm not sure if I can get sources to back this up, but my opinion is that the time you spend in hell and the level of comfort you enjoy in hell is directly related to your conduct in life. So if you're a good guy, you won't spend that long there, and it won't be that bad, and then you'll be back again. Whereas if you're a bad guy, you could probably spend a long time there before you're good enough to be reincarnated. And it doesn't seem like they have this. The key thing of reincarnation in Eastern religion, like in India, is that you're trying to stop it. Like you want to free yourself from karma so you can be free from samsara, which is the cycle of reincarnation, and that's your ultimate goal. But that doesn't seem to be the ultimate goal in Germanic paganism. Like there doesn't seem to be any evidence that they're trying to escape this cycle in any sense. So maybe that was something that was invented in India, and other Indo-European pagans were just like, you're going to come back at some point. Or maybe that's what the meadows, Bassisfella is. And maybe that's what Odin Saka means. It's like when you've finished and you've reincarnated enough times, you don't have to go to hell anymore. You don't have to reincarnate. You can go up to this lovely meadow and chill out there. I don't know what they do there, but it's nice.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Very, very valuable video. Anything else, Garrett? Anything else you wanted to cover?
Yeah, maybe this might be for a separate video, but the world tree, was this a literal tree believed? Or
Well,
could it have been,
I believe in it.
okay, or could it have been
When you think,
a symbol for something like, here are these different worlds that are energetically connected and there's a bridge to it?
it is, in the sense, a bridge is a good way of putting it. I consider it to be, I mean, like we said with the Ojibwe, they use the drum becomes the tree, and then they're going up and down it for their shamanic journeying up and down. And in our tradition, well, in the Germanic tradition, we have the Ratatuskus going up to the eagle at the very pinnacle, Vedufumnir, and down to the Nidhug at the bottom. And I think this is like some kind of representation of a spirit journey. You can go up and down. And Odin also, he takes on in different myths animal shapes that aid him in the going between different worlds. Like when he retrieves the mead, he has to first become a serpent to go down into a hole, and then he becomes a hawk or something, an eagle, and then flies away. So this is somehow instructional, I think, for people who have these. This is a different video, like the shamanic traditions within the Germanic tradition of like Vikti, and people who can take on animal forms and spirit projection, like people with cipher practitioners and other magicians, wizards or whatever you want to call them, did this kind of thing. And I think the tree is like a navigational tool for these people, like how to ascend upwards to like the spirit world above, whatever's up there, the branches of the tree, which is associated with stags and eagles, and to go down, which is associated with snakes. So I think, yeah, to me, this axis mundi, this central cosmic pillar, is a real thing, but it doesn't mean it's a tree that exists in a physical form that you can touch.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Tom. You got anything else, Thor?
That's it.
All right.
Thank you for being here.
Thank
Really
you
cool
again.
episode.
Yeah. My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for talking to me, guys.